My name is Katharina Körner. I am the Principal Researcher for Technology at the IAPP, the International Association of Privacy Professionals. We have 80,000 members around the world, and I'm super happy that we can have a session with Nishant today. Nishant Bhattacharya is an author of the book Data Privacy, a Runbook for Engineers, and a privacy engineering executive. And one of the people I admire most in this space, and I'm so glad we can have this session together and you can share your insights and experiences.
Thank you, Katrina. Thank you all for coming here. There's a lot of stories, examples. The goal of this is going to be a casual fireside chat kind of situation, so we are looking forward to questions as well. So thank you all for coming.
Yeah, perfect. Yes, very much so. So we really welcome questions throughout the session, and we can have conversations more or less. So if you want to move more in our direction, that would also be nice.
Awesome.
Okay. So data privacy, so privacy engineering is like this fast-growing field. There are like a couple of predictions, like the talent shortage in privacy engineering was predicted already by PricewaterhouseCoopers last year. It's one of the mega trends in privacy, and very often in this growing privacy engineering teams we see in companies, or like one person or teams, very often it sits in security, and very often privacy engineers pivot from security into privacy engineering, and that's why we chose this topic today. How can this be done, and what tools, for example, can be leveraged for privacy engineering, security tools or security infrastructure and services that you already have, and how can privacy and security really work together, like that it's a win-win situation, and there's no one better to talk about this as you, Nishant. So this is some disclaimer. So should we sit down?
Please.
Okay. So let's start with the question, what is privacy engineering?
Yeah, I always love it when there are topics to talk about where there is not an official definition, and I started working on privacy engineering more than a decade ago, and this was totally by accident, so there was no real canonical definition, there was no industry accepted vocabulary. Like even now, people don't always understand what privacy engineering means. People use security and privacy interchangeably. Sometimes people think of security and privacy as pure compliance. So my definition here is, it is one thing for us to think about privacy as a value, as a human right. Those are abstract concepts and it's the right thing to do. But how do you think of privacy as something that you can actually build into the company's culture? How do you think of privacy as something that you can tell the customer you built for their benefit? How do you demonstrate the value of privacy to your board of directors who pay your salary and my salary for that matter? So I think of privacy as a product and as a platform. How can you build something that will essentially give the customer what they're looking for? So when you think about something like data export, every customer theoretically has the right to email you and ask you, give me a copy of all my data. Now, if they just send you an email and you go around running queries in your data store and collecting that data and send it to them, that's not a very elegant, scalable way of doing things. But if you build a tool that indexes all your data, builds a proper mapping, identifies, authenticates a user, does it with automation, gives the legal team a few more days to review the data and then send it out to the customer, that's a platform, that's an actual product. So I think of privacy engineering as the ability to build products, platforms, and processes in a way that complements your business and protects your customer, and therefore protects your business as well. So if you can do those things cross-functionally across the company on an ongoing basis and scale with the rest of your business, that's what privacy engineering is about. It is not theoretically that different from stuff you do from an engineering perspective, from back-end engineering or front-end engineering. If you are a full-stack engineer, in my mind, you're a privacy engineer. So being able to do it for the benefit of the company and the customer without always having clear requirements, that's what privacy engineering is about.
Thank you. Maybe we ask the audience what their background is.
Sure.
Who of you is already working in privacy or as a privacy engineer? Oh, thank you. So that's half of everyone. And the rest of you, are you security professionals? Is there also some legal? Oh, thank you. Is there some legal person here? Hi. Thank you. So, okay, then everyone knows we don't need to talk about the different, what we want to protect, right?
Sure.
Like security assets and privacy, like the rights and freedoms of individuals. I think we don't need to dive into this too much.
Exactly.
Or do you want to say something about this?
I think it's extremely helpful to at least understand conceptually that at the end of the day, given that we have GDPR in Europe, we have CPRA in the US and multiple state level laws, it's going to be a while before we get to a point where privacy engineering becomes prescriptive. It's going to be very difficult for, even on the security side, we have so many different breach notification laws. So it is extremely difficult for the typical engineering mentality to remain, where you wait for somebody to give you very clear prescriptive requirements and you can implement privacy and security. That's just not going to happen. So the reason I wrote the book she talked about, the reason I'm doing this presentation here, is to send a message that anything you do to innovate and protect your company at scale and therefore protect the customer's data is going to become part of privacy engineering definition. So the right to be forgotten has a lot of definitions to it. The right to be remembered has a lot of definitions to it. So I think having that clarity is going to be pretty critical. But that clarity is not going to come from a legal standard or a legal regulation passed by somebody else. It's going to come from a company's ability to demonstrate that here's what identification risk was before, and here's how identification risk goes down. Sometimes it means you have more data at the end of the process because you have used differential privacy. So it almost sounds weird that you have better privacy because you have more data. So there's going to be a judgment question here. So that's what privacy engineering is about. It's not about necessarily just the laws or just the tools. It's about processes and judgment as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very interesting aspect with differential privacy. The more data you have, the less bias you have, while preserving privacy, you can still have better outputs. Should we move on, or is there a question at this point? So the IPP also has a privacy engineering section, and we also have a privacy engineering advisory board, and we worked on a definition on privacy engineering that will be published like in June or July as a basis for discussion. And we also had we defined we had a definition in the middle, and then looked at all those different domains where you can actually bring privacy into product, services, architecture, and it's really like from data science, right, to physical architecture even, or infrastructure engineering, software engineering, so user experience. So it's this vast field, right? It's really hard to put it all in one bucket.
Yeah, and I think the larger goal we're trying to get at here is that there are ways, and there'll be examples in this presentation as we go forward, especially if you report into security or security and privacy work together, there is amazing potential to sort of use security tools to achieve privacy goals as well. The reason this is so important is because oftentimes security and privacy don't quite know what to make of each other. So oftentimes people think of them as the same thing, but there is a significant opportunity for people like yourselves in the security side can get a second lease on life and have a second incarnation to your culture, to your career, by using your tools that were initially built for security for privacy as well. So there's an example coming up in a few slides here.
Yes, please. So let's move on. So there are different privacy products that we discussed in the preparation for this presentation. Would you like to expand on that?
Absolutely, and a lot of these products are in no particular order, but if you think about it holistically speaking, if you want to protect your business, you need to understand what you have. What data do you have and where you have it? What is the risk attendant to the data? Have you actually made it possible for that data to carry that risk with it? That is, if somebody down the road looks at that data, will they understand what the risk is? Is there the ability to identify that high-risk data and delete it? Is there the ability to locate data correctly and export it correctly when the time comes? Is there the ability to manage access control, that is either by way of ACLs or by way of encryption? How do you make sure that if somebody were to actually get a hold of your infrastructure and physically break in, which is always possible, how do you make sure that they can't walk away with the data? It's a bit like somebody might pick the lock on your front door in your house. How do you make sure that you don't leave cash under your mattress so they steal it? It's bad enough that somebody got into your house. It's even worse if they manage to find all your cash under your mattress. So encryption and ACLs are critical because they are essentially ensured to make sure that you don't lose your data. So the goal here is to first avoid the bad headline and then avoid the bad impact. But if somebody gets in your infrastructure, that's a bad headline, but it makes matters even worse if they manage to steal your data. So there is a mutuality of interest for security and privacy, have the ability and the incentive to work with each other. So that's what that's about. So if you think of all of these products, any mature, growing, reasonable business that wants to have a sense of stability should have these products anyways. If you run a business at scale, if you operate in multiple geographies, if you're going through high levels of growth, if you are under regulation, you should have these capabilities anyways because of M&A activities, because of divestitures, because of growth. Privacy just gives you the forcing function to get these requirements in place. So I should think about these not just as privacy products, I think about these as business products as well.
Yeah, that was my question. So why do you call it privacy products? Is it like because you need to make a business case for it, or and it's not a list?
Absolutely, yeah. So happy to take that question. Yeah. So I think of these as privacy products because a lot of companies have bits and pieces of these capabilities anyways. Let me give you an example. So the very first one, detection and categorization. So if you work for a company and you have absolutely no clue about privacy at all, let's say you work on the sales side of the company and you have sales contracts in place and you identify the names of your customers, the sector they're in, the kind of data they collect from you, things like that. It may not be privacy data at all. Okay, it may be IP data. It may be data about their actual enterprise customers. It may be about if you sell retail, it may be about sales commission rates, it may be about compliance regimes, it may be about something totally non-connected to privacy. That is information you do not want to lose. It could be an internal rogue employee, it could be a contractor, it could be a third party that you are aligned with who has bad security practices, and the data could walk out the door. It is entirely possible that you have data that could be very embarrassing were it to leave your front door, has absolutely nothing to do with privacy. So you need those capabilities anyways. If you extend those capabilities to first name, last name, to add email address, you can now add a privacy angle to it. So a lot of companies have a lot of these tools anyways to protect their IP, to physically protect their customers, to protect their business reputation, to enforce contracts, etc. The goal behind calling these privacy products is that this is for the first time that you actually need these products from a regulatory perspective. A lot of companies have invested in these products historically to protect their business anyways. Getting the privacy name in there helps you focus, helps you get a sense of prioritization for it. So that's the only difference. And what happens is, especially that's been true in my career, initially when I started at companies, I would make the case for privacy to essentially build these out. Then I would find out that some engineer somewhere else in the company has built these products anyways. For example, to collect consent. And now I can give that engineer more support, more ability of legal teams working with them, the ability to spin up a CMS with Drupal, and now it's a privacy product. But at the back end, it's the same capability. It's the ability to ensure that the company collects data only with user consent. So think of these as privacy products in the beginning, but eventually as you grow and scale, they become business protection products.
Like, if we, for example, take the example of access management. So, I mean, it's a security measure to have, or control, to have like solid access management, right? So how do you communicate internally that it is now also a privacy product, or like, do I need to change it? Or like, I don't 100% understand how you use those tools and communicate it that it's also relevant for privacy.
Sure, I can jump in.
Okay.
Yeah, so access management means several things. It could mean ACLs to ensure people can only access a certain amount of data. It could mean access control regimes to make sure that you can monitor who accesses what. And yes, you're right, Katrina, that is initially a security impulse, because if somebody comes in from the outside and tries to get access to data, and they shouldn't have access to that data, you should be able to block that access. It is about making sure that there is alignment between need and privilege. However, you can think of things going 2 steps further. I used to work for Netflix back in the day, and this is public information at this point. So initially, we used to train our customer support agents, and unlike a lot of companies, when you call Netflix customer support, you actually talk to a real human being. You can tell them, hey, my content isn't streaming, or I'm getting the wrong geography, et cetera, et cetera. All of these trainees were getting access to real-time customer data. And my initial observation was it is pretty helpful for them to get access to customer data, because now they know exactly what a real customer is going through, so that when they go through their training and when they finally graduate, they can help a customer real time. The question is, do they need real customer data while they're in training? Could we not create synthetic data? Because during my first week in training, I heard this person say, do you have any idea what Michelle Obama watched last night? This was July 2016. So a trainee employee who was not even a full-time employee of the company at the time now knew what the First Lady of the US had watched last night on Netflix. So that's a business risk, that's a reputation risk, and there's also the potential of causing somebody serious harm if what they were watching on Netflix the night before becomes public. So access control can take several forms. It could, like I said before, block access. It could create a wall between authorization and authentication. You can also make sure that you can manage access clearly, in the sense where if an employee looked at something that they had no business looking at, you can ask them, hey, what the hell are you doing here? And also making sure that if you can correctly modify the data so as to make sure that you can find the right balance between training and efficiency on the one side and security on the other, that's possible as well. So the whole point of access control here is start with a tool that was initially built for security only, repurpose it to make sure that there are multiple ways to ensure access control is happening, and make it about more than just security. Because if you think about access control as purely security only, all you're doing is trying to prevent breaches. But when it comes to private security, there are a lot more risks than just breach. You could also have a situation where somebody comes in when they're supposed to, but then grows their access, or there could be a situation where after the initial authorization or authentication, more data was added and became available to the company in a way that shouldn't have been the case. So privacy angle for access control is about making sure that you are continuously looking at the data, continuously monitoring the access privileges, and making sure that somebody doesn't do what they aren't supposed to do with the data.
Okay, thank you. Should we move to the privacy as platform
Sure.
slide? Sorry, those are the examples.
And I can
yes,
talk to an
please.
example,
Yeah.
So I wanted to give you an example of how you think about privacy as a platform. So think about one of the most painful processes a company goes through, and that is the dreaded privacy and security reviews. And what companies typically do is they want to essentially have this moment in time where they can just hit the pause button and make sure the risk doesn't walk out the door. And this is typically why in a lot of companies, people have privacy and security reviews right before something ships. And that is essentially a safety valve for companies because it gives the legal team one final definitive opportunity to say, no, this is not ready to ship because there is a privacy risk or a security risk. And that is like the image on the left-hand side. You having to carry somebody else. And you see the dude here is not too happy because probably the kid's not his and he's tired of the kid stepping on his shoulders. The challenge with that is that initially it might seem very liberating. Initially it might feel very, very freeing because you now know that you have somebody at the end of the process who's waiting to sort of catch the risk and make sure that stuff doesn't walk out the door. The problem is it is impossible for an attorney or a legal team or a compliance team to catch every risk in the 10-minute review that you have to do. Think about the number of ERDs, think about the number of PRDs, think about the number of specs, think about the number of architecture diagrams, think about the number of tools that ship out every single day because of continuous delivery. It is literally impossible for any legal team to catch those and stop those risks from happening. So that is like carrying somebody on your shoulder and the efficiency simply doesn't scale. It's a bit like having to enter 15 different passwords. I remember when I was an engineer at Intel back in the day, I had to essentially enter 6 passwords before I could get into the control recipe, which let me decide how to code the Intel test chip. I used to write code to make sure that the chip Intel was manufacturing was in adherence to Moore's law, which is making sure that a certain number of transistors fit on the test chip every single year. The challenge with that is that at some point people got tired and people would extend their sessions, people would not walk away from their computer and make sure that this computer was always on. The risk behind that is the computer would remain on, which means if anybody walked into their office, the recipes were out there. So the risk here is that on the left-hand side, something that starts out with a benign, honorable motive, which is to make sure that the risk doesn't become real for the business, becomes a burden to the business. And the moment security and privacy are seen as a burden to the business, you will find engineers find workarounds around the process. And that you have defeated all benefits of security and privacy at that point. So on the right-hand side, I have a diagram which is theoretically my wife trying to go and get into the front door. So when I bought my first house back in 2007, I wanted to show she was my wife at the time, she was my girlfriend at the time. I wanted to show her, hey, look, I'm not a total loser. I have a good house in a good part of the city. Unfortunately, I forgot my keys at my work and there was no way to get in the front door. And my wife essentially took her hair clip and opened the front door and we got into our house. So essentially I broke into my own house 2 days after buying it, which sounds very good, but if you have an engineer in your company who's like doing the same thing at scale, think about the risk. Think about the risk from a privacy perspective, from an AI perspective, from a business perspective, from an insider risk perspective, heaven forbid, from a compliance audit perspective. So what you don't want is a situation on the left-hand side where somebody feels tired, somebody feels beleaguered, somebody feels burdened from a privacy perspective and decides to give up on the process. And then on the right-hand side, you want to avoid a situation where engineers, creative engineers, very smart engineers try to break in the front door. You do not want a situation where privacy becomes a blocker, nor do you want a situation where privacy becomes something easy to jump through for people. So this diagram is about how do you build privacy products keeping in mind these 2 diagrams. When you go back to your office, when you go back to your company, when you go back to your school, when you go back to your law firm, ask yourself, are you creating process and products that are forcing people to either be on the left hand of this diagram or the right hand of this diagram? That is what you do not want. So that's what these diagrams are about.
Okay. I thought the left one means that we can leverage the security assessment for privacy.
Yeah, you absolutely can. What you don't want is a situation where, and there's a diagram coming up in the next few slides that will talk about this, but what you don't want is a situation where if you look at that kid, you want that kid to grow up one day and walk on her own. You do not want a situation where you have to hold the kid on your shoulder every single day for the rest of your life, right? The diagram here is saying that you do not want a privacy security review process that will force you to handhold engineers, which will make you feel burdened, and handhold engineers will make them feel like they can't ship stuff out the door. Eventually, you want them to realize that privacy as a product and as a platform is something that is embedded in the back end that will help them ship stuff in a privacy-safe fashion without creating unnecessary bureaucracy. That's what the diagram's about.
I see. Are there some questions at this point or experiences that you have maybe as privacy engineers, like working with your security teams, where it's like preventing each other from doing things? Or, please.
So I've recently learned about a new architecture for data called Data Mesh, and I've been learning, which is basically shipping data as a product. And so this seems to be a trend, and I'm just wondering if you've seen other examples of where we might be able to kind of promote privacy of being added into some of these new architectural approaches.
Absolutely, and that's a great point because part of the challenge, Deborah, here is that privacy has to be embedded into the data and the infrastructure and the code across the board, because it's one of those things which it's everywhere. You have everybody in the company writing services, people growing infrastructures by putting data in the cloud, third-party vendor risks taking place every single day. So the space is increasing every single day, which is why privacy engineering is such a booming profession, even at a time like this one with job cuts, etc. So when you talk about data mesh, what you are talking about essentially is how do you make sure that you bake privacy into the data itself? If you'd asked me this question 2 years ago, it was about how do you prevent risks when it comes to a data sharing perspective. So if you share data for ads, if you share data for personalization, if you share data from a UI perspective, how do you make sure that the data is shared from a privacy safe perspective? So if you can measure identification risk for using K anonymity, L diversity, that was step number one. How do you make sure that you can measure the size of data to compare that to the size of the business revenue growth? So data mesh is about sort of the next incarnation. How do you build privacy into the data so that when you make a step, whether it's access control, whether it's encryption, whether it's cloud migration, whether it's data sharing for ads purposes, how do you know that the risk you are taking is in line with your expectations, is in line with compliance, is in line with enterprise contracts, is in line with customer consent? Remember, we talked about consent beforehand. Right. If I have your consent to share your data, as long as your identification risk is 1%, do I have to create more fake data? Do I have to aggregate data? So we're talking about building tools into the data itself so that right before the data ships out, there is an automation-powered checkpoint to ensure that if you have a very high identification risk, you can hit the pause button on data sharing. Because remember, there are certain things you cannot undo in life. You cannot unsee data, you cannot unshare data, you cannot unhack data. So having that data privacy baked into the data itself means that no matter where the data goes, no matter what happens to it, you can protect the data automatically at scale across the board. So I would think of data mesh as a part of that larger move towards not just privacy as a product, but data itself as a product of privacy.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe that's a good point to go to the next time about platforms. So you said.
I have another question here.
Oh, please, please. No, questions are the best.
Okay, so I am a more recent privacy technologist.
Sure.
I actually have a question from the data governance sense. So you discussed repurposing existing tools, right? How do you go about finding these tools, one? And two, what if you don't find them and you need to build some sort of infrastructure or architecture from scratch within the organization, and it might come with costs and resource allocation? Then that's the second question. How do you sell that to management to allow you to deploy and provide you the resources and the funding?
So let me try and enumerate your question just to make sure I don't forget it. So first is you want to talk about data governance and sort of like how this applies to that larger conversation. The second is how do you find the right tools or build them? And third is how do you make the case? How do you sell the argument to build those tools to the leadership of the company? Is that a fair summarization?
Yeah.
Okay. So data governance doesn't quite have a unified definition yet, but I think of, very simply speaking, data governance is about having policies that can clearly protect customer data if those policies are enforced. So how do you create an overall tech ecosystem where you know what you have, you understand the risk behind the data, you can allocate policies to manage that risk and implement those policies and verify that you have implemented those policies correctly, and then demonstrate to the world, to auditors, to compliance governments, etc., that the policies were correctly enforced. That end-to-end coverage is what governance is about. Just as when you talk about healthcare coverage, when you join a company, you have health insurance, you have dental insurance, you have vision insurance, you have long-term, short-term disability insurance. So governance is kind of like that. Multiple platforms, multiple tools, multiple processes, making sure that your ability to manage risk end-to-end can be A, created, B, implemented, and C, proven. That's what governance is about. So when you hear this phrase, people often get confused because it means a lot of things, but really it means about making sure that you have multiple things working across the board. Remember, back in the day, you could think of governance as being the one check, either the IT person who checks your laptop or the legal person who checks your product before it releases out. Governance is about having those checks across the board. Go in line with the previous question Deborah asked, how do you make sure that privacy is baked into the data? Governance is about making sure that privacy is baked into the data, into access privileges, into your identity as a customer or user or employee, or across the board in the infrastructure. So that's the first answer to your question. The second thing I would say is I'll give an example again from my Netflix days. I had to make sure that everybody in the company didn't have access to everything, because when I got to Netflix, the culture was freedom and responsibility. Everybody should have access to everything. It was a sign of the culture. Every employee was highly trusted. The bar to get in was pretty high. Obviously, I'm going to say that because they hired me. So the belief was everybody should have access to everything, which made sense at some point, but beyond a certain point, as the company grew, as the employees grew, as the footprint of data grew, it was very, very, very hard, almost impossible that everybody should have access to everything. The example I gave before of the customer support agent, right? So I asked the company at an all-hands meeting, what if I took away your access to this data within 7 days? And the reaction was something I can't really mention in a public forum like this one. People are pretty upset because the idea was, how could you take away access from us? So I said, okay, fine, I'll implement a policy that is a lot more benign. So I went to the security team and they had a tool called Metatron, which is open source to this day, which basically means that if somebody tries to access data that they aren't supposed to access, we will swap the encryption keys, which means they will have access to the data, but they won't be able to see what's in the data itself. And what that meant was, from a security perspective, if somebody ever got into the data center or somebody had a hack, if AWS or GCP had a hack, people couldn't get a hold of the data. And I said, if we can use this tool to protect our customers' data from third-party hackers, surely I can repurpose this tool to use it to protect our data from incorrect or malfeasant access within the company. So I said, everybody tells me they need access to everything, so fine, I will not change any encryption keys for the first 2 weeks. But if I find out that you said to me that you need access to this data and you didn't access it within 2 weeks, I will send you a warning email that your access is about to expire using Metatron. And if you still don't access it within a week, I will swap the keys. And I expected after the first 3 weeks for people to riot at the street and people to yell at me because somehow everything broke because their access keys had been changed and they couldn't access the data anymore. As it turned out, 95% of the queries, I'm talking about all the queries the engineers are running across the board at Netflix, across Europe, across the US, across the world, 95% of the queries were successful. Only 5% of the queries broke. And of that 5%, only 2% of the people came to me and said, hey, my query didn't work anymore, which means 98% of the hands that went up in the all hands that said, I need access to the data, didn't know what they were talking about. They thought they needed access to the data, but they didn't really need access to data. So this was an example of repurposing a security tool to achieve a privacy goal. It was an example of how you can build a culture of privacy without fundamentally pissing off the business. And it's a way to demonstrate to the business using actual real-time metrics that, hey, we have way too much risk that we don't need. Like, if you don't need access to this data, you shouldn't have access. I told engineers after the fact that you have access to this data and you don't need access means that if your credentials ever get compromised, this access will be abused by somebody else. And it'll be your name on the block because you kept this access even though you didn't need access. So this is an example of repurposing security as a concept to educate people about privacy, repurposing security tools to achieve privacy goals. Now, the third question is, how do you make the case to the business? Well, you find examples where you have to protect privacy using security tools, and you demonstrate to the business how you can use these tools for multiple purposes. I've had multiple examples where I've shown the board of directors where, just as I can, as a privacy engineer, use security tools, my tools built for privacy can be used by other teams within the company as well. So as an example, if I need to clean up data for a privacy perspective because that data is now old and cannot be used anymore, the AI team has the same interest. Their goal is to reduce the size of data because they need faster queries, better models, better insights, less bias, things like that, right? So there is a mutuality of interest between security and privacy on the one side, between privacy and AI on the other side. So you have to be able to come up with examples where you were able to use a security tool to achieve a privacy goal, and then use that and come up with other examples as well. So one thing I'll tell you, since you're new to the domain, is come up with examples. It's very, very hard to come up with metrics at the beginning, but the way it works is first use an existing tool, then use the metrics from that tool, then come up with a hypothetical example, and that's how you can go forward. So that's the best way to do it. But I'm sure as you and all of you learn this field a little more, there will be other metrics, other examples, and other products that will help you build your examples as well. My entire book, all my speeches are full of such examples.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you for the question.
Another question there.
So one of the challenges that kind of like seeing with privacy is first understanding the data that you have, data classification.
Can you go a little bit closer to the mic, please?
Oh, you can't hear me?
I can.
Again now, yeah.
Okay, cool. So data classification. So I think it's do you have any word of advice there? Because you know, one of like the challenges we have in my company is like, yeah, we have so much data. We need to be compliant. How do we know where the data lives, what data lives, PII, you know, like a kind of
Yes, that's a great question. So I remember the quote from Don Rumsfeld, our former defense secretary back in the day. There are known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. And when it comes to privacy and security, it's the unknown unknowns that people are afraid of, but really it's the known unknowns. Things you know that are bad that you chose not to fix until it was too late. So the known unknowns and the unknown unknowns are what keeps me up at night. I shouldn't have as much gray hair as I do, but that's just what 10 years in privacy does to you. So my response to you would be, there is no easy answer to your question. You have to start in multiple places. So you have to look at data through the lens of context. Remember, in the movie business, people say content is king. In the real estate business, people say location is king. When it comes to privacy and security, context is king. So if you, for example, store people's location data, if you have a customer that, for example, drives around in LA or San Francisco or San Diego, if they drive around downtown, their physical location may be risky, but it may not be that risky because downtowns are typically very crowded, hopefully during the daytime with commerce, offices, etc. But if they live in a very small town in Nevada where only 50 people live, if you have their IP address or their location GPS coordinates, it can cause a significant level of privacy risk because there's not that many people who live there. So the first thing I would do is look at what you have from a conceptual perspective. I'm not talking about actual data stores. Like in your line of business, what data might you be collecting? What users might you be satisfying? What use cases are you collecting the data for? And come up with a conceptual framework of what that risk looks like. And then you can build detection engines using regular expressions, using other regex patterns, etc., anomaly detection techniques, and identify what that risk looks like for it. So as an example, if you have my GPS coordinates with 5 decimal points, maybe in New York that could identify me because the location is very, very precise. But if you zoom out with 3 or 2 decimal points, maybe the zoom out location is broadened to the point where you can't identify me anymore because now you are looking at 4 or 5 blocks in a city like this one, it's very hard to identify me. So data classification is about what you have, how identifiable is it, and then what is the risk of identification. So as an example, if you have my location data, but you also have my email address, you also have that data for multiple locations, so the risk keeps changing. So from a classification perspective, you have to look at the data conceptually, come up with a risk assessment, come up with tags to affix to the data, and then once you identify the data based on detection tools, then say, okay, what does identification look like based on the question I believe she asked over there, and then reclassify the data on an ongoing basis. This process is kind of like training an AI model. Everywhere I go these days, generative AI is a topic du jour, right? So those AI models are not always done once and for all. The AI models keep being retrained over and over again as the data gets collected, as the data gets improved, as the old data gets deleted. Privacy and security classification is the same way. You understand conceptually the risk behind classification and inventory. You apply tooling to it, you apply control regimes to it, you apply policies to it for governance purposes, and then you check the classification one more time as the data changes, and then you apply the policies one more time, and you reclassify. So this becomes a continuous self-fulfilling circle. The benefit of doing this is that you are applying risk mitigation techniques to your business on an ongoing basis. It's like working out every single day. It's like managing your diet every single day. It's like changing the locks on your car or your front door every single year to make sure that you're modifying and mitigating risk on an ongoing basis. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Yeah.
Hi. So my question is related to the example that you gave on Netflix. Since you mentioned that like you implemented access management and a lot of people didn't know needed the data. So there's often an argument about innovation part that it could come at a cost of innovation if you are implementing privacy or access management. How to push back to those arguments, and how was it implemented at Netflix side? Like how it was not considered as an hindrance towards innovation.
That's a great question. So first up, I'll say the people who complain that privacy security often slow them down have a point. Let's be very honest about it. For 10 years, we told engineers across the board that you will get promoted by owning something end to end. You will get promoted if you drive a certain amount of engagement. You will get promoted if you build a certain number of features. And in exchange for those expectations, we will give you full access to the data. We will give you a very, very low tax process. And the more you ship, the more you build, the more customers will click, and merry-go-round it goes. Just as we told every startup founder 5 years ago that keep raising as much money, don't worry about making money as long as you have a lot of growth. And that gravy train started ending last year. So everything in life that starts ends at some point. So these complaints you hear from your colleagues about privacy, security slowing them down are coming from a place of, hey, you told me 10 years ago that these laws didn't apply to me. It's like that old Jerry Seinfeld clip, right, where you order a lot of food at the restaurant and somebody brings you a bill at the end, like, what, you want me to pay for this food? So that's what the industry is going through right now. So the point, I sympathize with the points. I used to be one of those complainers. I tell people, when you hire somebody for the privacy engineering role, you want to hire somebody who knows where the bodies are buried, and in my case, I do, because I put those bodies there when I was a PM back in the day. So what I would recommend from a solution perspective is, how do you identify areas where the risk is the highest? So my favorite example is the privacy security review process. There is no reason why you should have to wait until release day for somebody to do a privacy or security review. As I mentioned before, the attorneys don't have the scale, they don't have the time, they don't have the tech expertise, nor do people like you or I who might be engineers, right? So why not build a tool that the engineers can use to run their ERD or PRD through? So if you tell me from a privacy review perspective, let's say I'm the attorney and you tell me, I'm not collecting any sensitive data. That's very hard for me to verify. Unless I physically run my queries or check your ERD, I may not have time for that. But if I build a scanning tool that looks at your code, that looks at your ERD, and identifies things like data ingest or API collection or no rate limit, if you identify the words and the names engineers typically use, that'll say, hey, maybe there is something here. It's a bit like walking through an airport and getting put aside for security. Right now, that's a controversial topic, but fundamentally, as long as you have checks and balances placed across the business, you reduce the risk that there'll be one point where somebody will have to shut down. I think what people are complaining about is the delay induced in the review process and the unpredictability of it. So what I'm saying is if you have the governance process start at the very beginning of the funnel, and if you have it happen in a low tax fashion across the board, that reduces the risk of having somebody slow down completely. And I think there's a slide we have of the funnel. Maybe you can show the slide.
Should I go?
So, okay. So I think I was going to wait for this slide, but let me use your example. So on the left-hand side represents the old world, where the data gets collected on the left-hand side. The data flows from left to right. The data size grows. There's inferences. There's data sharing that's happening. There's data purchasing that's happening. And what the companies have been telling is on the right-hand side, right before data gets retired to the archival storage, we will do governance. That's a bit like locking the door after the thieves have stolen all your furniture. It doesn't really work. It's like security light. It gives you the impression of security without having security really happen. Same thing with privacy, right? So the other challenge of the diagram on the left-hand side is that if the data size has grown really vast, it is very hard to have enough compute power, enough memory to process governance in a meaningful fashion. So I've seen examples where queries that were written for governance purposes, for security, for privacy, for deletion, extraction, etc., time out because the data size is so vast. So what I'm saying is the left-hand side is the old way of doing business. The right-hand side is the new way of doing business, where essentially you apply those policies on a selective basis on the left-hand side at the point of collection. It'll help you understand where the data came from, who collected it, why it was collected, who it was collected from, etc. And based on that, you can make some initial decisions that may or may not be 100% accurate, but you can at least come up with some judgments and then allow for the data to go forward if the risk is low. Because it's easier to make that decision when the size of data is like small and before people have done stuff to the data. It is very hard to make that case on the left-hand side because at that point, you can either look at all the data and slow the engineers down and still not get the job done correctly, or you have to just accept the fact that you're not going to get the risk mitigated anyways. So that is where most companies are these days. I talk to a lot of people in my book tour. People tell us that we have the right public posture. We talk about privacy security all the time, but behind the scenes, all we have is a ton of data and we don't know how to shrink the size of it. And the data size will not shrink unless you physically shrink it at the very beginning of the process. So the left-hand side is a bit like eating like crazy all year and then getting on the treadmill for 10 minutes on the 1st of January because you passed a New Year resolution and expecting your weight to go down. What I'm saying is don't eat too much to begin with, don't skirt the exercise to begin with, and do it on an ongoing basis because that's how you can reduce the risk. So hopefully that gives you some ideas to play with there. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that does. Thank you.
But how do you claim the seat on the table from the very beginning? Like, I mean, if I'm a privacy engineer, like, and I sit like on a different floor, and I mean, how do I get in, like from the very beginning, in the design phase already?
Well, you pull up a chair. I mean, what I've learned is there is no one ready inside a room to let me in. If I only went where I was wanted, I couldn't go anywhere. So what I would say is make the case based on something. So at Netflix, I made the case based on the fact that 98% of the company has access to what the President of the United States was watching on his Netflix account without justification. That got attention. When I was at Google, I showed people how many deals we were struggling to close in Western Europe because we had way too much data and because Microsoft was eating our lunch when it came to compliance. What you have to do, and this is where the security-privacy relationship is very, very important. The security folks have the tool, but they don't have the story. The privacy folks have the story, but they don't have the tools. So how do you use the security tools to tell the story, come up with the examples, make the case, and get people to remember, right? At the end of the day, you have to show people that there is a risk here, but there is also a way to solve it. And then eventually you'll have to make the case to build a program, build fresh tools, etc. But the first thing you can do is, before a compliance regime falls upon you, before something bad happens to you, you demonstrate, hey, this is what could happen. And in this day and age, there are many, many examples of actual breaches, real-time risks, real-time incidents that have happened, in which you can demonstrate to your board of directors and your C-suite is, we have some tools, we have risks, and we also have the ability to prevent these risks before what happened to those people across the street could happen to us. That's how you make, I mean, you may not succeed every single time, but you will succeed a lot more often than not. Because remember, there are people who agree with you, but they're afraid to speak up. There are people in the AI team, in the sales team, the legal team, the marketing team. What you have to do is take their stories, take the tools from the security folks, and combine the two together to come up with a strong narrative. And Once you land something good at the beginning, the rest of the road gets a lot easier. Remember, I used to be in your shoes 10 years ago. Today I have a book on this topic. Clearly somebody's listening.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What do we have on the next slide?
Yeah.
Privacy's platform driving efficiency and
Yeah.
transparency.
So this is for all the folks here, including you, Katrina, who are asking, how do we make the case? So we have our 10-minute marker. So if people have questions, you guys might want to line up because we are down to the last 10 minutes. So when you build a lot of tools internally, you have the ability to make it easy for your company to get privacy right across the board. I think of two kinds of customers. If you are an engineer shipping the product that's going to make the company money, you are my customer, because unless you have a job, I don't have a job, because you are the one building the tools that makes the company money. So unlike a lot of people in privacy, I would strongly beseech you, don't think of the business as your enemy, because if the business doesn't make money, you don't have a job. So when you build tools, for example, to delete data, to enumerate data, to classify data, to inventory data, to create perturbation, to create obfuscation aggregation, when you build those tools, it is in your interest to make those tools available to your entire community of engineers at the company, your AI specialists, your business scientists, etc., and make them available through some sort of a central API. So when you implement a service at the company, for example, to monetize data, or to process payments, or to integrate with a third-party platform, all this service now has to do is integrate with your one single privacy API, and in the back end, multiple microservices can do deletion, categorization all at once. When you sign into, for example, your Google app, you're signed into Gmail, you're signed into Google Calendar, YouTube all at once. Google makes it very easy for you to sign on to multiple Google services at once. That's the whole concept of authentication federation, right? So if businesses work that way, why shouldn't privacy work that way as well? Why make people chase you for deletion here, reviews there, obfuscation there? Aggregate as much as possible and make sure those tools are available to engineers across the company as easily as possible. Remember, if you think of privacy as a product, as a platform, as a business, you will succeed a lot more than if you think of privacy purely as a risk. People will always respond to incentives a lot more than they respond to threats. So in the middle here, you have the aggregation of all of these privacy APIs in one go, available to your engineers, your customers within the company. Once you put your central privacy API through the paces, and once a lot of people within the company use it, you can now make them available via an external privacy-facing dashboard. So my former team at Uber released a tool a year ago called the Privacy Center. We got a ton of good publicity. We got a lot of publicity in the Washington Post, the New York Times, etc. And that opened up a lot of business opportunities for us as a company that historically were not available to us because of our past mistakes in that space. So when you build these tools for internal engineers, you make your internal customers your internal QA testers. Once the privacy APIs work correctly, you can convert those into a customer-facing API. So having a privacy checkup capability, understanding what your driver rating is, where you got good ratings and where you got bad ratings. All of those are back-end privacy APIs that were made initially from a compliance perspective that helped the engineers within the company and eventually became a customer-facing privacy dashboard. So this entire slide is about privacy as a platform, as a business, where you build these capabilities opportunistically when you get a chance. When the moment is right, aggregate them as a platform for internal engineers. And then when the moment is right, aggregate them for customer-facing dashboards. It's a lot easier once you start building these capabilities. So the key is finding that initial story, that initial example, and that's where the security privacy partnership is critical, like I've said before.
From which company size on could that make, I mean, sense? It would always make sense, but like buy versus building, like how, I guess you need to work in a pretty big company to build such a platform.
Well, yes and no, it depends upon you as a company. So sometimes small companies are soon to be very big companies. Sometimes big companies are companies that have gotten big but have hit upon a maturity. So I would worry less about the size of the company or the size of the engineers or the size of the code base. I would think about the size of your idea, the size of your future customer base. Always, always, always innovate for the future and always, always, always protect for the future. Don't worry about the past. And of course, you have to worry about the past from a compliance perspective, and that's not a choice. But when it comes to building a privacy and security program that scales, always code for the future because you never know when that moment's going to come. What you do not want is a situation where a privacy or security risk that you did not account for or didn't take seriously blows up in your face just before your Series B round or just before your IPO. You do not want to be in that situation because companies that are in that situation right now have the attorneys, they have the money to hire people like me. Startups don't have that kind of money. So I would say, especially if you're a small company with a dream to become a big company, this is what matters to you more than anyone else. So I think we're down to the last 5 minutes. Any more questions?
Please.
I'm happy to answer them. Or we can keep going too.
Okay. That's actually the last slide. So that's the,
Yeah. Perfect. So I'm not going to read this slide, but I'm thinking about, it's always helpful to think about privacy and security in terms of a roadmap. And I have never followed this roadmap in any company I've worked in, but this is something I walk in with because it gives me a starting point. Like where should you be from a privacy journey perspective? And your journey should be very, very similar to the journey of your company's biggest product lines, your company's security team, your company's compliance regime, your company's business growth regime, etc. If you find out that you are being too aggressive and your company doesn't have the product growth for it, maybe it's time to wait a little bit because your company doesn't have the level of risk that justifies the privacy investment. But if you find out that your company is growing its data size or its customer base or its business unit or its M&A proposition, and you don't have the privacy roadmap to go with it, that's a problem. So you need to make sure that you have these 3 phases lined up, not because these 3 phases have to always work perfectly, but because it'll give you the ability to check with your business on an ongoing basis to make sure that the business growth and the privacy growth are happening somewhat concomitantly without being out of sync. So this is something I would cite as a reference, not necessarily as a mandatory thing to do on an ongoing basis. And with that, I'm out of slides here, so I'm happy to take any more questions with you or happy to shake hands if we're done here.
Hi, thank you for the talk. You mentioned data classification a number of times, and you also talked about how location, for example, right, as just to use it just an example, can actually be fairly coarse, and then it's not really that much of a concern, down to being you know, a single room or even more fine. But one thing that I find I always struggle with is this mismatch. The fact that the tooling, the legal aspects, just the conception of data tends to be very much a classification, a binary. It is sensitive, it is not sensitive, but in reality, we all know it's not, right? That there is a continuum here, right? It can be super coarse or it can be super fine for location and so forth. How do you work through that? Because I really find that that's hampering a lot of efforts where you end up with essentially asinine decisions because we decided that this was sensitive when you look at the data and there's no way in the world it is, but that's where the policies and the classification, et cetera, led you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So that's why you need an
Thank you.
exception management process to identify corner cases like the one you mentioned. But the other thing I would mention is having a detection regime that covers as many data stores as possible, even data at rest, making sure that you are continuously looking at not just the data, but the context behind the data. So as I mentioned before, if you have a lot of location data, if you have my location data, for example, and you want to build an online profile about me to serve ads to me, maybe serve ads to me based on my long-term habits rather than my short-term locations. As an example, if I'm coming to downtown San Francisco a lot in the morning and I leave at 5 p.m., it's entirely possible that I work here and I don't live here anymore, right? So understanding and inferring my physical presence and preferences based on the data and then changing the data itself. What a lot of companies do is they use the data to gain the insights, but then they don't use the insights to shape the data. That's the second part that's missing. So the point behind your question is the data size grows continuously and the ability to improve the data doesn't quite happen. So what I'm saying is the point of privacy, unlike security, and this is where security and privacy are different, in security your goal is to prevent and protect. In privacy your case is to prevent, protect, and create maturity. So you want to physically change the data on an ongoing basis because you have either gotten the benefit you can from the data or the data tells you something about the customer that is not going to fundamentally change anymore. So I would say, think of the data governance process, to my earlier point, as a virtuous circle. Use the data to protect the customer and use the customer's information to protect the data itself and make it ongoing. It's not something that will happen in an ongoing, like on a sudden basis, because the data keeps changing and you are also, to your point, starting with a large volume of data, but this is something that should be thought of as sort of a continuous iterative process rather than a one-size, one-time-fits-all approach. So, thank you.
So our time is up.
Sure.
I want to thank you, Nishant, very,
you.
very, very much. Oops.
Thank you.
And all of you, of course, and the IPP, we also have a booth, and we have my colleagues here who have some material. We have a couple of courses on privacy, also for technologists and for privacy management. My colleagues know all about it. And if you would give us a nice rating, here is the QR code not, so I don't know how this works. But thank you very much, and we're still here to chat.
Thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.